Don't sit down. Time to get up. John McManus, President John Birch Society, say no to the New World Order.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you very much for hosting the entire conference. When the assignment was to tell whatever it would be that would so horribly affect the American people, American Catholics and so forth, there was certainly plenty of choices. And one of the choices that I mulled about was sending your child off to college. It is a very dangerous thing to do. Now, present company excluded, I want to tell you one of my favorite limericks. And it goes like this. There once was a man named Gesser whose knowledge grew lesser and lesser. It soon grew so small, he knew nothing at all, and now he's a college professor. I thought this audience would especially appreciate that. Right. Okay, let's go. Philosophical antecedents of the New World Order, at least in what we call modern times. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he said, anyone who says there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church should be thrown out of the state. That's putting it pretty plainly. And then Voltaire. I'm tired of hearing it said that 12 men suffice to establish Christianity, and I desire to show that it requires but one man to pull it down. He being the one man, of course, right? So those are philosophical antecedents of what we're going to be talking about, which is mostly we're going to be talking about the penetration of the Catholic Church by its enemies. Okay? Now we're talking about the New World Order, so I thought I'd show some examples of some people who are favoring the New World Order. Here's Richard Nixon in 1967 writing an article for the Foreign Affairs magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations where he was anxious to see the evolution of a New World Order. Right? That put it pretty plainly. Okay, next. Here's Nelson Rockefeller. His goal, a New World Order. Right? Now, these people know what they're talking about when they say this. Next. In 1975, which was the year before the 200th anniversary of our country, there was a declaration of interdependence which was being spread around Congress, and 120 congressmen had already signed on to it. They were going to replace the Declaration of Independence with this, and of course it called for to bring forth a New World Order. Well, my John Birch Society, we got our people nationwide interested in that. We showed them the names of the 120 who had signed on this thing, and they caused a bit of a stir. And all of a sudden, 50 or 60 of them said, no, I made a mistake. Pull my name off that. I don't want my name on it. The whole project died. But that was the intent, to have a substitute for the Declaration of Independence, and it failed. Now, here's a fellow who wanted a New World Order, and a fellow named Castro. I mean, there were many, but we got some newspaper clippings for some of them. Gorbachev, yeah, he was in favor of it, the New World Order. The Boston Globe ran an editorial in 1988 calling for a New World Order, and so on. His Papa Bush, just prior to the war against Iraq, the first war against Iraq, we've already had a second, and maybe we're going to have a third, I don't know. But out of these troubled times, a fifth objective, a new world order can emerge. We are now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by its founders. Every time George W. Bush mentioned the New World Order, he mentioned the United Nations. Right? That's a key to a part of what I'm going to try to present to you here. And then he said, I think that what's at stake here is the New World Order, a reinvigorated United Nations. You probably know that the John Birch Society has been campaigning for a long, long time to get us out of the United Nations. Right? Here's a newspaper article, I think it was 1992, Joe Biden, How I Learned to Love the New World Order. Right? Joe Biden? Isn't he a Catholic? Well, that's questionable by itself, right? So there are lots of people who have, over the years, embraced the idea of promoting a new world order. And I dare say that every one of them knows exactly what it means. It means a totalitarian world system run by the United Nations. Okay? Now, if we go back to the beginning of our country, we see that there is a Great Seal of the United States, and it's on the back of the dollar bill. And part of it, the part that we've blown up here, is the pyramid with the all-seeing eye at the top. And below the pyramid, we see the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum. Now, the Latin Mass Catholic would know the phrase Per omnia secula secularum, right? So you know that they didn't even spell seclorum correctly. It should be secularum. And at the bottom of the pyramid, there's Roman numbers. The Roman numbers add up to 1776. Now, you could say that that's the time when our nation was founded. We broke away from the British. But you could also go back a few weeks prior to the 4th of July in 1776, go back to May 1st, and you find that 1776 was also the year of the formation of the Illuminati conspiracy against mankind. At the top it says Annuit Chaeptus, right? Latin again. Let our undertaking be favored is a loose translation. And it's not an appeal necessarily to God. It could very easily be an appeal to the other side of the earth. And that's what I believe it is, really. So how did that get on the dollar bill? Well, first of all, it was the work of a man named Thompson, who was the Secretary of Congress when we had the Articles of Confederation. We no longer had a Secretary of Congress after the Constitution was formed. But he was tasked with the job of putting together a Great Seal for the United States. So this is the obverse side of it. The other part of the Great Seal is the eagle, and that's to the right on the dollar bill. If you have a dollar bill, you can take it out and look at it. Now, what I'm saying here is that there were influences within the high officialdom of the United States government as far back as 1783, when this occurred, that wanted to put the New World Order on our Great Seal of the United States. There are even stained glass windows in the Capitol building down in Washington, which have both the eagle, the front side of the Great Seal, and the pyramid with the eye. The pyramid is a good symbol for the Illuminati because it was built on concentric circles of power and influence, radiating all the way to the top where there were very few. And the man who started the Illuminati was a man named Adam Weishaupt. Okay? There he is, Adam Weishaupt. He was a professor at Ingolstadt University, a Jesuit university. Every once in a while we run into somebody who say he was a Jesuit priest. He wasn't. He was a layman. But he was teaching at Ingolstadt and forming the Illuminati. He learned a lot about organization from the Jesuits. Now, what were his goals? Well, I've read a lot about him, and I've summarized what he wanted to do, and that was to overthrow all governments, destroy all religion, abolish private property, deify sensuality, repudiate marriage, and state control of children, leading to world government. Now, if you recognize any of those things happening in our time, let me tell you that it's not a coincidence. It was planned that way. So Adam Weishaupt is a very important figure in history, and you won't learn about him in college. You have to learn about him elsewhere. There were two books that were published after the French Revolution of 1789. about the Illuminati and about the conspiracy and about the Illuminati's takeover of Freemasonry in continental Europe. The book on the left is called Proofs of a Conspiracy, written by a British professor named John Robeson. That book we have reprinted in the John Birch Society. It came out in our Americanist Classics series. And then the other book was by a French priest who fled France during the French Revolution. He fled for his life. And he was able to get out and get to England, and he wrote his book about the memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism, Abbé Augustin Barruel. Those two men never met, but what they said about the conspiracy of the Illuminati was totally in sync. There were no differences between what one said and the other said. Okay? And we go ahead and we find out that George Washington, shortly after he left the presidency in 1797, was given a copy of the Robeson book by a reverend in Fredericktown, Maryland. So he read Proofs of a Conspiracy about the Illuminati conspiracy to take control of the world. And he wrote to Reverend Snyder in Fredericktown, "Reverend Sir, it was not my intention to doubt that the doctrine of the Illuminati had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of this fact than I am." So George Washington knew about the Illuminati. He didn't find out until he was out of the presidency, or he may have had some information about it beforehand. Okay? The main targets of the Illuminati were expressed by its leaders in Europe. They were going after thrones and altars. The thrones being the Catholic monarchy, and the altars, of course, being the Catholic Church. They never deviated from that, and they're still at it. The goals of the Illuminati: obliteration of Christianity, deification of sensuality, proscription of property, abjuration of morality, repudiation of marriage, state adoption of children, universal license, and the wrecking of civilization. Right? The French Revolution in 1789, of course, this is 13 years after the formation of the Illuminati. In 1783, there was a Congress of Masonry in continental Europe, held in Germany at a place called Wilhelmsbad. And at that conference, the Illuminati took control of European continental Masonry. I'm no fan of Masonry, of course, but what the Illuminati did with Masonry was make it even worse. So the French Revolution was brought on, that should be brought on, not of, brought on by the Illuminati. Thousands of priests and nuns were murdered. Many fled to England and elsewhere. The country was thrown into a severe chaos, and France has never recovered. Now, down at the bottom here, I talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was a resistance against taxation to help pay for the Revolutionary War, and they actually had an armed rebellion in the center of Pennsylvania. When the federal troops went there to put down the revolt, they found French flags flying in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, meaning that the French influence, the Illuminati, was already prominent at that point in our own country. The rebellion was put down, and we can credit Washington and Adams and John Jay for being very strong opponents of the Illuminati influence in the United States. Now, in 1885, there was a Monsignor, Catholic priest in Scotland, and he was giving lectures on the subject of the Illuminati and its conspiracy and its successors. We'll get to some of them. And it was so profound and so important that he was ordered by church authorities above him to put it in print. In other words, write a book. And so he wrote a book called The War of Antichrist with the Church. His name was Monsignor George Dillon in Scotland in 1885. I have a copy of that book. It has recently been published in America. Go ahead. It was republished in 1963 by Britain's Publishing in London, but they chose a new title for it. The new title they chose was Grand Orient Freemasonry Unmasked as the Secret Power Behind Communism. Now, I don't think they had a right to do that. You know, a man writes a book and he puts a title on his book. Who is to say that somebody else can come along and change the title? But they did. That book is available. I think you can still get it through Amazon under the title Grand Orient Freemasonry. But there's a group out in California that has published it, and it's very important reading, I think. There are the two frontispieces of the books. The one on the left is the original, the War Against the Church, and the other one is the Grand Orient Freemasonry Unmasked. That's the two different titles of the same book. The Illuminati spread its tentacles throughout all of Western Europe and even into some of Central Europe. And it had its agents throughout other countries as well, including ours. The Illuminati started again in 1776, and we moved to the Italian Carbonari, 1810, and its leader, Giuseppe Mazzini. He eventually took control when Weishaupt passed away a few years later. He took control of the whole conspiracy. His goal was world government, and he was successful in starting groups in country after country called Young something. There was Young Italy, Young Germany, Young France, Young England, and there was also Young America. And we have suffered from that. It was some of those people in Young America who helped to start the Republican Party in the 1850s. People wonder about the Republican Party. They've turned on their heritage. No, they haven't really. The leaders of the Republican Party are very much promoting the same kind of thing that we see in these other organizations. But Mazzini went to England in 1847, and he teamed up with Karl Marx. Now, before we leave the name of Mazzini, I want to mention that there's a very important book written by a man named Edward Mandell House in 1912, and its title escapes me for a minute. Philip Drew, Administrator. It's an outline of, it's a novel. It's a poorly written and kind of confusing thing, but its whole purpose was to spread the work of the conspiracy. And he didn't put his name on the book, but he let it be known that it was indeed his work. He called for world government. He called for everything that Karl Marx wanted. And the interesting thing about Mazzini is that the dedicatory quote in the book, Philip Drew, Administrator, is by Mazzini, Giuseppe Mazzini. That Edward Mandell House would pick something said by Giuseppe Mazzini as the dedicatory quote in his book, I think is a hugely significant point. So it just shows some more continuity here. Well, Karl Marx and Engels finally put together the Communist Manifesto. Now, I brought along some copies of the Communist Manifesto, and I want to talk about it a little bit. But it came out in 1848, and here's the German edition of it, and neither Marx nor Engels' name appears on the cover. Marx was actually insignificant as far as the leaders of the conspiracy were concerned. He was a hired hack. He was a plagiarist. He was a very hateful man. He didn't even take care of his own family. I don't know anything good about Karl Marx except that he's not with us anymore. Except, unfortunately, a lot of what he said is. So the Communist Manifesto is an outgrowth of the conspiracy against mankind started by Weishaupt, kept alive and promoted by Mazzini. The Communist Manifesto calls for abolishing the family. And I mention that because you can look into the Communist Manifesto here and you can see bold force statements talking about abolishing the family, replacing home education with social, they said, destroy parent-child relationship, cancel marriage, abolish countries and nationalities, cancel religion and morality, remove all Christian ideas. Is any of that happening in our country? Right? If you go to the Communist Manifesto, you will see the famous 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. It's on page 25. And you read down, you see progressive income tax. We got it. We see centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. We got it. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Okay? We got that too. In fact, every one of those 10 planks listed here are partially or fully in place in the United States of America, and it all happened in the 20th century. So I was at a meeting in California not too long ago, and there was a reporter there from one of the big newspapers. And I mentioned the Communist Manifesto, and I urged the people in the audience to buy a copy of the manifesto and to study it. Well, he wrote a very funny article. It wasn't really as much a slam as we expected. And he said, I never expected to go to a John Birch Society meeting and be told to read the Communist Manifesto. Well, we want people to read it. We want people to know that it is being implemented. It is far more enforced today than the Constitution of the United States. All right, now I want to talk about a man named Orestes Brownson. He had a remarkable religious odyssey. Brownson started out as an agnostic. He became a Calvinist, and then a Universalist, and then a Socialist, and then a Unitarian, and he finally ended up in a Catholic church. And he became a Catholic apologist. Maybe some of you have read some of what he's written. It's worth reading. He's buried at Notre Dame University in South Bend, Indiana. There's one chapel on the campus there, and if you go down into the lower church, you see down the main aisle, there's a kind of an interruption where there's a metal covering over it, and that's his gravesite. Now, Brownson, early in his years, was involved with the conspiracy. So we see him saying approximately 1829, but the more immediate work was to get our system of schools adopted. To this end, it was proposed to organize the whole Union secretly, very much on the plan of the Carbonari of Europe, of whom at that time I knew nothing. So the Carbonari had its influence in our country, and it affected even Orestes Brownson, who kept searching and searching and searching, and happily he finally ended up in the Catholic Church. But the point I want to make is that the Carbonari were active in the United States as well, active through Young America, and as it was in Young France and Young Germany and Young England and every place else. The Carbonari published the Alta Vendita. The Alta Vendita actually published itself. That was the highest lodge of the Carbonari. And in the Alta Vendita we read, let the clergy march under your banner in the belief that they march under the banner of the apostolic keys. Lay your nets like Simon Bar-Jonah. Lay them in the depths of the sacristies, the seminaries, the convents, rather than in the depths of the sea. So we can see that the plan of the Alta Vendita was to infiltrate and send their people into the seminaries, send their people into the convents and into the sacristies and so forth. And ladies and gentlemen, they have been very successful at doing that. Right? Carbonari's Alta Vendita actually stated, our final aim is that of Voltaire and the French Revolution, the destruction forever of Catholicism and even the Christian idea. The work which we have undertaken is not the work of a day, nor a month, nor a year. And they go on and talk in the booklet published by the Alta Vendita about the need to realize that some of their people will work for a lifetime and not see the result, and others will come and take their place. And I'm absolutely certain that that is exactly what has happened. All right. Next. Now, Pius IX was the Pope during the troubled years in Europe. He was originally a liberal politically, but he became a significant enemy of the revolution, and he also became its target. When his life was threatened in 1848, he left Rome disguised as a simple priest. He spent a year in Naples before returning to the Vatican. He authored the Syllabus of Errors, proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. We could talk a lot about that. The Syllabus of Errors, of course, is something that it's much like what Pope Pius X promoted with the Oath Against Modernism. It's that kind of era is mentioned, and I certainly suggest to you that you get out a copy of the Syllabus of Errors and take a look at what Pius IX said way back in 1848, 49. 1848 was the year of revolution throughout Europe. There were revolutions all over the place, and he almost got caught up in it, almost got killed. But he did survive and went back. After he proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, there were a lot of the clergy that didn't like that idea. They didn't want that to be an infallible truth of the Catholic Church, and so they protested. And it was only a few years after that that the Blessed Mother appeared at Lourdes to Bernadette. And when Bernadette asked the Blessed Mother, "Who are you?" she said, "I am the Immaculate Conception," which kind of settled the argument. Freemasonry was condemned by popes from the early 1700s by every pope up to and including Pius XII, who died in 1958. The popes after that, John and Paul, more or less welcomed Masonry. Pope John actually said there's no problem. Anybody in the Catholic Church who wants to be a Mason, you go right ahead. You're right.
John the 23rd was
Well, we'll get to that. The Illuminati gained control of continental European Masonry in 1783. I've already mentioned that. Most Masons in America, however, are victims, not conspirators. They're victims of something that they've joined for various reasons, some of them just for personal economic reasons. But Masonry becomes a substitute for religion. I remember meeting a man one time who expressed interest in the John Birch Society, and I went and chatted with him and so forth. He said, well, he said, I'm a Mason. I said, well, okay, let me ask you a question about Masonry. I said, does Masonry become a substitute for religion? And he kind of scratched his head a little bit, and he finally said, you're right about that. It does. So I said to him, well, I consider that subversive and so forth, so I guess maybe you and I aren't going to see much more of each other as far as the Birch Society is concerned. We don't care for that. All right? Pope Leo XIII, Humanum Janus against Masonry. All right? Tear off the mask of Masonry, he said. He wrote Rerum Novarum, the great social gospel. He was an enemy of socialism. He fought against agitators seeking worker revolution. Pope Leo was a wonderful pope. Next. We follow that by Pope Pius X, who reigned from 1903 to 1914. And he became pope after the remarkable intervention denying the papacy to Cardinal Rampolla. The cardinals got together behind closed doors where nobody's supposed to talk about what goes on in there, but somebody did. Poland's Cardinal Puzina announced a veto of Franz Joseph. And he had stood up when Rampolla was well on the way to becoming the next pope. And some of the cardinals said, well, what's this all about? Well, it turned out that the head of the Holy Roman Empire had many years before been given a privilege by a pope that he could veto. He couldn't name the pope, but he could veto somebody who would be a danger for the church if he got into the papacy. And so the only claimant to that authority was now Franz Joseph. There wasn't any Holy Roman Empire in 1903 to speak of, but Poussinus stood up and it threw the consistory into a tizzy, so they decided on a moderate, an intermediate candidate, and it turned out to be Giuseppe Sarto, Pius X, who's one of my favorites. I'm glad to know he's a saint now, Saint Pius X. He fought against modernism. His encyclical Pascendi is very much worth reading. We face a lot of modernism today in the Catholic Church. Modernism being that dogma isn't fixed, dogma has to adapt to modern tastes and modern times and so forth. And of course, if that's the case, then there's no such thing as dogma, right? He chose for his Secretary of State Cardinal Merry del Val, with a kind of a Hispanic name, but he was an Englishman, had some relatives from Spain, obviously, some of his ancestry. And he served magnificently as his Secretary of State. I had the pleasure not too long ago of discussing Cardinal Merry del Val with Judith Sharp and find out that she's a big fan of his. And she and I had both read the same book about Merry del Val, which I highly recommend. I can't remember the name of it, though. All right. We go to Pope Pius X again, and he required all clergy to swear an oath against modernism. And he forced some clergymen out of the priesthood who wouldn't swear to the oath, and also were demonstrably modernists themselves. One excommunicated priest named Terrell boasted that numerous other modernists were still among the clergy and would continue the subversion. And I think that's an accurate statement by Terrell, right?
What about the quo primum decree? Wasn't that also the work?
No, that was, quo primum was Pius V. We go to Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958. And a very interesting thing happened there. As one of the top assistants of Robert Welch, the founder of the Birch Society, he sent me to France in 1953. It was in 1973. And I had introductions to some Catholic scholars in Paris and so forth. And he wanted me to find out what's happening in the Catholic Church, because he could see it was in trouble. And so I went in 1973 to Paris. I met with Bernard Fay, a man who had protected the Library of France against the Nazis and had paid for it. He walked with a limp. And I also met a man named Claude Arnault. In fact, Bernard Fay made sure that I met with Claude Arnault. Claude Arnault was a Frenchman who was what you might call a private detective for the Pope. And he was tasked to go to Sweden with some money, some letters of introduction and so forth, and to work with the chief of police in Stockholm and the Lutheran bishop who was a friend of the papacy. And the message, the mission was to get the Archbishop of Riga in Latvia out from behind the Iron Curtain, who was in his latter days, and they wanted to make sure he had the sacraments before he died. So Claude Arnault presented his request, whatever money was needed, documentation of who he was, and they told him to sit tight, and in a matter of a few days, somebody had gone over to Riga and kidnapped the cardinal and brought him back, where he was able to receive the sacraments and died soon after. I met Claude Arnault, and he was a man who was willing to talk about his experience, but he didn't necessarily like doing it. because it indicted some people in high places. Well, he came back to Rome, jobs finished, and he headed home for Paris. They called his home in Paris before he even arrived and said they need him back. Because when he was in Stockholm the first time, he was asked what was the attitude of the Catholic Church regarding communism. And he said, well, everybody knows. Why are you even asking? But he repeated that the question had been asked when he got back to Rome, and so then he went home and they told him, come back, go back to Stockholm and find out why they asked that question, which was good thinking. So he went back to Stockholm and he was presented with a package of papers, told to give it to the Pope and nobody else. He later found out what he had brought back was correspondence between the Vatican and Moscow, and the correspondence was from Giuseppe Montini, who became Paul VI. What happened to Montini at that point? Well, he was relieved of his job as Assistant Secretary of State of the Church, and he was promoted to the Bishop of Milan. Milan is the center of communism during that period in Italy. So I asked Claude Arnault and I asked Bernard Fay, I said, the man is disloyal, obviously, and how does he get a promotion? How does he get this new job? And they said his friends took care of him. And they put some papers in front of the Pope and he signed them or something like that. So Montini got his new job. While he was in Milan, he befriended communists, and he hired a man named Saul Alinsky from America to come and train the lay people. Now, I would hope that most of you know who Saul Alinsky is. A very dangerous man. One of his students was a fellow named Barack Obama. Well, Pius XII allowed all that to happen, and he also tolerated the treatment that was given to Father Leonard Feeney. Father Leonard Feeney, the great crusader for no salvation outside the church. And he was thrown to the wolves and supposedly excommunicated, but you don't excommunicate somebody for disobedience. You excommunicate him if it's a dogmatic matter. But Father Feeney and his followers went and they formed St. Benedict Center in Massachusetts, and it's still going. Right? So here we had Pius XII died in 1958. The next pope was John XXIII, served for 5 years. There's a book called The Broken Cross, written by a Catholic apologist named Piers Compton. And he talked about Reverend Giuseppe Roncalli being inducted into an occult fraternity in Turkey in 1935. Now, I got quite friendly with Malachi Martin. He was living in New York City, and I would go and visit him occasionally. And I'd bring him some information that he didn't have, and he used to say to me, Johnny, you're a great resource to me, he would say, right? Well, I would hope to share that kind of information with him and with anybody who I think can handle it and needs it. So one time I'm on the phone with him, and I told him, I said, I just finished reading this book called The Broken Cross by this Englishman named Piers Compton. Are you familiar with that book? He said, no, I'm not at all. I said, well, it has a biographical sketch, which is not very complimentary, of Roncalli and Montini and Votilla. She said, well, can I borrow the book? And I said, well, I've lost a lot of books that way. I don't know what. I don't know. He said, no, I promise I'll get it back to you. And I said, well, if I can't believe and trust a Catholic priest, then I can't trust anybody. So I sent him the book. And then he called me up 10 days later, and he said, this book says that Roncalli was inducted into an occult fraternity in Turkey in 1935. Can you back that up, he said to me. I said, no, it's the first time I've seen it. I have no idea where to even go to try to find out. But I said, you have contacts all around the world. You know a lot of people everywhere. I said, you back it up. And he took that from me. And then another 2 weeks went by, and he called me up and he said, "It's true. It's absolutely true." So John the 23rd was a Mason. He convened Vatican II Council. Look what Cardinal Swinton said about the Vatican Council. The Vatican Council is the French Revolution in our time. Absolutely, right? Absolutely. Father Leonard Feeney was a famous Jesuit. He was a teacher at St. Benedict Center, which was like a Christian Science reading room that they started, some Catholics started, right outside the front door of Harvard University. He began promoting the salvation dogma. There is no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And he ran into a buzzsaw. He was supposedly excommunicated, but before he died, he was welcomed back prior to his death in 1978. And in order for him to be freed of this charge of excommunication, they asked him to recite the Athanasian Creed. Now, if you've ever read the Athanasian Creed, it starts off by saying there's no salvation outside the church. And it ends by saying there's no salvation outside the church, right? Now, the Catholic Church has three creeds. We have the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. And the Athanasian Creed ought to be much better known. But anyhow, all he had to do was to say that. He said, "I've been trying to get people to say that all my lifetime. And now I'm welcomed back into the church," right? Well, he started the movement of St. Benedict Center, and his followers are still promoting the salvation dogma, right? Vatican Council II, 1962 to 65. It was a pastoral, not a doctrinal council. First time in the history of the church that we had a council that was not there for the purpose of establishing or promoting dogma. In fact, both John 23rd and Paul VI both said we're not here to define anything, right? And I think the Holy Ghost was operating in that reality. The Vatican Council, too, refused to condemn communism. And then it was labeled the French Revolution of the 20th century by Cardinal Swinton from Belgium. Right? In 1978, we're now into the reign of John Paul I. We're right in the middle. You remember we had a pope that lived for 34 days, right? In the 34 days that he was living, an Italian magazine came out with an article. The magazine was called La Gran Loggia Vaticana, and if you can see that, you see a hood over the St. Peter's in Rome, a hood being the sign of Masonry. Well, the article talked about the fact that the author had come upon information saying that 120 some odd prelates of the Catholic Church were Masons, and it provided their date of entry into Masonry and their code name. And he was asking the Vatican for a response. Well, nothing was done, and 2 weeks later, John Paul I was dead. Mysteriously, yes. I don't know for certain, but John Paul I died. And the man who cleaned up the papal apartments after the death had been discovered and the body had been removed was a man whose name is on the list of the Masons. And if he'd done what he did in Rome, in the United States, he could have been prosecuted for disturbing a potential crime scene. He cleaned up the apartment, he took away all the medicines and everything else and whatever was there. And his name was Villot, V-I-L-L-O-T, and he became Secretary of State of the Catholic Church. Now, there's some really interesting things that happened there. Albino Luciani was Pope John Paul I, right? And he was a political liberal as well, and the hope was, amongst some of us anyhow, that he would turn out to be another Pius IX who was a political liberal and became a tiger for the church. but he didn't last long enough. Also, what happened is the man who wrote the article was soon gunned down in Italy. The man who wrote the article for Osservatore Politico. Now, I have a copy of the entire thing here, the list of the 120 prelates, and I even had it translated into English, and there are copies on the table over there for anybody who wants to buy. I have to charge something for them. I have to get some recovery on it. But another thing that happened there is it's just kind of bizarre. During the visit, during the, what did I say, how many days did he? During the days that he was Pope, he had a visit from Patriarch Nikodim of the Soviet Union. And Patriarch Nikodim was well known to be a KGB man. Right? He was a member of the KGB, and he was also the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, the Pope and Nikodim are together in a small room in the Vatican. All of a sudden, the Pope comes out and says, "Somebody get a doctor. There's something happened with the Patriarch." By the time the doctor got there, he was dead. He just died. And nothing was ever said about why. There's certainly a lot of speculation. I think that somebody switched the cups. But I don't know. Nikodim died. So the strange death of John Paul I is what we call it, and it contains the entire article from the Italian magazine and a translation of it. And I certainly recommend that you take a copy of that. Who are named as Masons in the article that appeared in Osservatore Politico? Villot was the Secretary of State, Swinens, the Primate of Belgium, Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, Casseroli, future Secretary of State, Levi, one of the heads of the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, and Bonini, Annibale Bonini. He was, at the time, he was the pro-nuncio in Iran, and he later led the group that revised the Mass. He's the one that got 6 Protestants to come and to check over what they had concocted as the Novus Ordo Missae, the new order of the Mass. And I even have a photo of Pope Paul congratulating Bugnini and his 6 friends, all of them lined up. So what do we know about Pope Paul VI? Well, there's plenty that can be said, but we're going to focus on a painting now. This is a painting of the Pope. A German Lutheran named Hansing came to the Vatican, and he asked if he could sit in the front row of the papal audiences and study the Pope so that he could put together a portrait. And he did so, and there's the portrait. Now, there are copies of this over there as well at my table. And it's absolutely hideous. I knew a woman out in California years ago who's passed away now. She was an authority on the occult. She had studied all the different occult movements and everything else. They never captured her, but she knew all about these people. And she's the one that put me onto this photo. It appeared in Smithsonian Magazine. It was a 2-page spread in Smithsonian Magazine. She said there were 17 Masonic symbols in that painting. Well, what happened? Well, the painting is still in the Vatican somewhere. I even have a picture of the Pope with the Vatican. Next slide. In the commentary at the bottom of the photo, we see 2 comments, 2 quotes from Paul VI. First of all, he said that the painting is a mirror of the situation in the church today. Then he said one almost needs a new philosophy to accept the meaning of this in its context. I'm sad to have to report about this, but I want people to know it. People have to know. We have to know who our enemy is. We have to know what has happened in the church. It didn't just happen evolutionary or something. There were deliberate people in there to get there, as the Carbonari had said, send your people into the sacristy, send your people into the seminaries, and so on. All right. There's the article. Next. Pope Paul VI selected Bonini to revise the Mass, appointed Masons to church posts, refused to meet with Sister Lucia. In his speech to the United Nations in October 1965, when he came to America, this organization represents the sole and only path of modern civilization and of world peace. The sole path to world peace is the United Nations. There will be no peace with the United Nations. Okay? I've forgotten the date now, I think it was 1983, I went to Rome and I had the opportunity of fighting for the Tridentine Mass with the papal commission that had been set up, and it turned out to be a waste of time, really. But I was with Father Francis LeBlanc from Arizona, and he was in a wheelchair because he had bad hips. So because he was infirm, he got to sit in the upper left-hand part. There were 50,000 people there, and this one section was set aside for people who had infirmities or relatives they brought who were ill or something like that, and the Pope would come down. They tell you to sit, and that the Pope will come down and you can greet the Pope. So he's coming down the row where I'm sitting, and I'm saying to myself, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? Well, he finally got to me, and I got his hands in mine, and I looked him right in the eye, and I said, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. And he said, God bless you in English, and took off. Okay, next. Benedict, a theological liberal throughout his life. There's an awful lot of things about Benedict that I didn't care for. But he mandated free use of the Tridentine Mass. No priest has to ask for permission anymore to say the Tridentine Mass. He resigned his papacy in 2013. His status, unknown to me. I don't know what his status is. I don't know if he knows himself. Right? Pope Francis, now the Pope, he's a captive of liberation theology. His comments have invited problems. Remember, one of the first things that he said was, they were talking about homosexuality, and he said, who am I to judge, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's the job of a pope to judge the act, not the person. But he didn't make that distinction. And all of a sudden, the headlines all across the world, the Pope favors homosexuality or has a loose attitude regarding homosexuality. And he's done that with several other things. All right? We're in for a rocky road. I'll close with this. This is a poster that came out of Brussels from the European Union. It goes back 25 years or so, where they are intending to rebuild the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was the beginning of nationhood, when God confused the tongues so that the people would not build a world government. And the confusion of the tongues led some people to go off over here and start a nation, and some over here and start another one, and some over here, start another one back here. Nationhood began at the Tower of Babel, and it was God's work. Nationhood is good, world government is bad. Those people building the Tower of Babel wanted a world government, right? Right? Go ahead, skip over this. There's a couple of quotes of, back up one. The first job of a conspiracy is to convince the world that conspiracy does not exist, right? That is a very profound statement, and it's very true. You mention some of these things to somebody you know, some neighbor, some coworker, some relative, and you're liable to have somebody immediately say, oh, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. Well, you're not. You're not a conspiracy theorist. You're a conspiracy factist, right? And don't let anybody do that to you, all right? We have a lot of evidence. One of the books that we have is called The Shadows of Power, The History of the Council on Foreign Relations. It goes back to Edward Mandell House and Woodrow Wilson and so forth. Those are the power brokers in our country. We're very much opposed to the United Nations. I have a small booklet, America and the United Nations, and I recommend that as well. So, one more. Robert Welch, the head of the John Birch Society. The plan is to establish the first stages of a new world order. This will be the Novus Ordo Seclorum, for which a self-perpetuating inner circle of conspirators have been working and scheming relentlessly during 6 generations. God bless you. What's the answer? The answer is Fatima, right? That's the answer in our time. Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta. Francisco and Jacinta already in heaven. We know that. Right? We can pray to them, ask them for their help. I think we could do the same with Lucy. The final secret was supposed to be made public in 1960. I remember saying, well, where is it? What happened? What happened? Sister Lucia was silenced by a succession of popes. Our Lady asked for daily rosary, 5 first Saturdays. Our Lady told the children, only I can help you. Say no to the New World Order. Thank you very much.